So for those who can't see, we do have some people here in the room. It's not bursting with numbers, but we encourage anyone to pose any question. And if you don't have a question from this, something's wrong. I haven't conveyed something right. This should beg questions, not give answers, beg questions. So, yes?
I just want to ask about the place of embodied knowledge in this.
Good. The question was, what is the place of embodied knowledge? Excellent question. Embodiment is an important term, a very important term, because we tend to think of language in more abstract ways. Words are symbols, signs, and yes, they have vestiges of the physical, but the direction we always are encouraged to travel is away from the physical, isn't it? But language is itself embodied. It's always coming from within, whether that's through our speech, so the very vocal apparatus that we use to convey our speech, or whether we physically engage with some other form of language, through writing, through typing, through reading, through encounter on the street with graffiti or what have you. And implicit in the question is also the sense that our bodies are a kind of language. I have a very particular kind of language I've been conveying, even though if your mics died somewhere along the way or our audio malfunctioned, you would still get something. God knows what. I fear a bit, but you get something just from my bodily gestures. So language is always embodied. I would encourage you to read Hélène Cixous's work on the nature of writing, called Coming to Writing Especially is what I've given, where she talks very much about the embodiment of language. Look at the first phrase here. How do you make meaning circulate when what comes forth is the signifier, the scene, and then look where she goes from here. An unfurling of a hallucinating carnal sound. It's a real thick, fleshy embodiment who surges up in your throat through your muscles. So we have to learn not only to read signs that are pointing away from the physical, but signs that bring us back to our very enfleshment, to the kind of gutturalness, visceral aspects of our conveying of any kind of meaning. Meaning just doesn't come in abstracted forms. It is always embodied in some way. So we must take that into account. And this is why you see shifts, particularly within the humanities, more towards these areas like material culture, for example, or questions around the body even in the more abstract disciplines of philosophy, constantly going to the body, phenomenology, etc. So it's a very good question. Now, to tease out exactly what that means would take another 4 or 5 hours just to start. But you get the sense of where we could go, and Cixous is a good person to travel along with here. Thank you.
So I have a question from the board, and I'm going to just read this out rather than try to.
Good.
To what extent is the process of attaching value to terms a deliberate ploy versus something which is insidious? Evidently, there are some, often in positions of authority, who attempt to appropriate or indeed misappropriate meanings and values for their own ends. How much control should we seek over this process? How much control do those who seek control really have?
Excellent question. It's about the relationship between language, the signification process, and value. Now, let's be absolutely clear about one thing. There is no such thing as a valueless language. Language, by nature, by definition, always comes laden with value, always. You cannot somehow create some kind of neutral space in language, or a vacuum in which it is valueless. It always is. Sometimes the value is more evident than others. Sometimes it's more potent than other times. But never is it without value. Never. So our opening little imaginary scenes of Elvis and Jesus, heavily laden, those terms. But you could find different levels of value all the way through there. And the question that we return to is the set of questions I asked up here about authority. Who has the authority to grant value, and to what level, in any and every encounter we have with our language? And the more you look and the more you study, the more you realize that there is always an authority out there determining the kinds of language that we're allowed to use. Now, we in the West, in the neoliberal paradigm of the West, pride ourselves in a freedom of language. And we have this sense that, unlike other regimes or political systems, our system is the most open, the most disconnected from those kinds of authoritarian and oppressive control mechanisms. And if you have learned anything over the last 5-6 years, if you've learned anything from Edward Snowden, if you've learned anything from the revelations that keep coming out about who controls what, Panama Papers or whatever, you will know that the West is just as complicit, and even more insidiously so because it's more behind the scenes than any previous communist regime or any other kind of totalitarian regime. So our task here in the West is to make sure that we're constantly vigilant about who is placing values where, and willing, courageous enough to stand up when we feel those values are being challenged or jeopardized in a way that we find uncomfortable or maybe even ultimately harmful. And so it's a very good question, and it becomes the task of the critical thinker. And here's where the term critical actually really gains some weight here. The critical notion is to unmask where some of these values and where some of the authorities behind those values really reside. That could be the entire focus of your research. Or it can be part of the methodological approach you have to your research. Or you just may want to constantly keep that in mind. But it's a lifelong task. It's got very little to do, actually, with your scholarship. It's got to do with everything of our life. So, good question.
Much knowledge about this. But I want to ask things like the hermeneutic humanities is like that you if you said like you said the destruction about the system.
Yes.
But like when you find some new ways, like you cannot always get the point. Will be like but in the end you said literally it's a circle.
Yes.
So it's like I confused, like if people if this used in the marketing or some applied in the different industry, because for the people have different how to say, it's like different in the first two pictures you show us, you said people have different understanding about this. And if people because when the people connect with these signs, they may use the other form, not just the language.
Okay, so there's a lot of commentary in the question there, and so to distill the question out of that, I have to interpret. And I think what I will do is I will concentrate on the question around the circle and see if that covers some of the issues that you're trying to address here. So I did suggest that our relationship in this, or across this gap, is not a linear one, but more of a circular one. And that we are constantly in this dance-like movement between both sides of the difficulty. Someone's understanding is never static, never stationary. It is constantly being fed by all the other relations around, and that informs your own relations and your own understanding. So we are constantly feeding off each other all the time. But in hermeneutics, there's an even more specific way of looking at the problem, and it's called the problem of the hermeneutical circle itself. The hermeneutical circle is a dilemma we find in any approach to gaining understanding or knowledge. It has two dimensions to it. On the one hand, we know, and let's just take a standard text here. We know that it is made up of individual constituent parts, but it sits within the entirety of its overall package. And if that's a novel, then we've got the whole idea of the narrative from beginning to end. Now, in order to gain meaning from this text, we have to look at the individual parts. There's no doubt about that. We have to segregate in an analytical way. And this is literally what analyzing means. Cutting out and looking at the individual parts as they're set out. But the only way we can make sense of the relations between those parts is to see it within the whole. So we are dependent upon the whole in order to connect up the individual parts. But that assumes we have some sense of what the whole is. So what is the whole made up of? Well, it's made up of the individual parts. So then you scratch your head and you say, well, if we can't understand the whole until we understand the individual parts, but we also can't understand the individual parts until we understand the whole, how do we start? Where do we go? And you can see why this would require a constant movement. Part, whole, part, whole, part, whole. Now that leads to the second part of this. And this is even the more challenging part. This is more spatial and this is more temporal here. To know anything presupposes a certain degree of knowledge already. There's this famous idea of the philosopher who says, you can't ask a question until you already have a sense of what the answer might be. There's no other way you could formulate the question. Similarly here, we do not know anything in a vacuum. We understand things because we already have a pre-understanding or a set of presuppositions. And it's only with those presuppositions that our understanding makes sense. Then someone comes along and says, well, where did those presuppositions come from? Oh, well, they're based on a certain degree of understanding. But the understanding was what you were seeking in the first place. So how can you have the understanding prior to not having the understanding? And there is, again, that circle, that dilemma. Now, how do you get out of this dilemma? Let me just give you Martin Heidegger's quick solution here, because I think it's very, very helpful. Martin Heidegger, in his famous Being in Time, says, well, yes, it's a vicious circle. There is no way to get out of this. But, he says, if we see it only as vicious, then we look out for ways of avoiding it, even if we just sense it is an inevitable imperfection. Then the act of understanding has been misunderstood from the ground up. To understand, he says, what is decisive is not to get out of the circle, but to come into it in the right way. It's not to try and avoid it as if we ever could, but is to enter it in the right way. So maybe an answer to, or partial answer to your question, is we find these dilemmas all throughout our research. And we ask ourselves, how do we overcome this dilemma? I'm obviously doing something wrong. And Heidegger's little sense here is not to abandon it and say, oh, I've got to start all over again, but to see yourself in this constant movement, this circular movement. What is the right way? Well, that's part of your task. But the task is never, I found it and now I move on. The task is always in this circular movement. Sometimes they talk about the hermeneutical spiral as well, as it's kind of moving up.
I have several from the board. I'm going to read them in order rather than kind of skipping around. But one person was asked, could you comment on the relation between hermeneutics and the interpretation of the moving image? For example, feature films, please. I'm a film studies student, and I'm currently focusing on realism in relation to cinema. It strikes me that this is another way of thinking about the gesture and the body in kind of another way.
Excellent. Yeah. And were you going to add one to that, or should I just address that?
Let's do that one, and then I'll do that.
Okay, yes. Moving image is just another text. Absolutely, another text. But we know, if you're in film studies, that it is a very elaborately constructed text. And there's no better example of the quote-unquote system of relations than the film industry. What does it take to make a film? Even if you are the most individual of auteurs out there, you still require this army of people who are constantly making decisions with you, for you, against you, to try and develop this collaborative moving image that we see on the screen, which is a very powerful one, because the moving image is really, what happens is we become the camera. Our eye is the one that is really following the scene. But the camera dictates that for us all the time. So the hermeneutical task here is not only to see the web of relations, the nexus that is the film industry and all the components that make up a film, but also to negotiate between how the camera acts as a kind of all-seeing eye that then you assume yourself as the viewer. And then you have to be very careful. Well, the camera is dictating how and where I'm going here. This is why watching film is so much easier than watching a play. You got to make the choice in live theater. There's your stage. Am I watching over here? Am I watching over here? Oh, now there's 3 or 4 things going on. Now which one do I? You're constantly making choices. It's hard work, theater. Film, constantly making the choice for you. Actually, I want to see what's going on, but no, that film's gone up to her face and way too closely for my liking. But you have no choice. Now, part of your hermeneutical negotiation is to be aware of this. Say, why is the camera doing this? What is it forcing me authoritatively to view, to watch? From what angle? With what lighting? Etc., etc. So a whole host of hermeneutical issues. Very good.
The next question, and this relates to a question from last week that I'm also going to bring forward, because this is about kind of the relations among these thinkers, and I think particularly Barth, Derrida, and maybe Damon, who didn't come up today, but who came up last week, often get lumped together, particularly when we are trying to dismiss the insights of deconstruction, perhaps. Not we specifically, someone else. But so this is a question about the difference between Barth's notion of structuralism and Derrida's post-structuralism. That's the first part. And the second part is about how the insights of deconstruction, or the instability of language, gesture, text, etc., affects scientific discourse where, at least so we say, the target is transparency of meaning, bedrock truth,
Good.
so on and so forth.
Good.
So, super.
Roland Barthes has an interesting journey himself. And he, within his own career, moves from structuralism to post-structuralism himself. So his last texts, or the latter part of his career, has already followed the quote-unquote logical conclusion which Derrida in 1967 is pushing him towards. So Barthes himself can see that if we construct this structural paradigm in order to analyze certain texts, the ultimate authority or bedrock with which we have to totalize that system increasingly becomes less available, to the point where Barthes ultimately realizes we don't have that ultimate authority, and therefore he says, let's play in the text. One of the texts he has is called The Pleasure of the Text. It's a great phrase, and it's something you as researchers constantly need to hold on to, by the way. The text is something that is a great joy to be playing in. It's hard work, and it can be serious work with major consequences. But the moment you lose the joy in playing with it, you should think twice about your career trajectory. You need that joy in order to bring out its fullness. Now, what both Barthes and Derrida introduced, I think in a very healthy way originally, was this sense of the pleasure again. Academia was starting to lose this sense of the text closing down in on itself and becoming its own autonomous little world. And Barthes and Derrida, both together, but in this path in which Barthes himself was able to join eventually, was able to open this up. And of course it has profound implications, this kind of pleasure, for not simply the aesthetic text, but for texts that are claiming to have some kind of factual basis to them, the scientific texts. So then the question becomes, well, do those texts deconstruct themselves? Now, a word of warning about this idea of deconstruction, because it really plagued the 1970s in particular. What excited all the literary critical theorists of the time, especially at Yale and otherwise, who were inviting Derrida and all these people over, was, great, wow, we finally got something that can take us in a new direction and open things up. But they turned deconstruction into a kind of technique, something that you come and impose on the text yourself. How do you deconstruct this text? And we continue to see this all the time in the way that that verb is employed. Oh, can you deconstruct this? Can you deconstruct that? Well, however you're using that term, it's not the way Derrida was trying to get us to think about it. Derrida was trying to say, deconstruction is something that happens. You don't implement it yourself. It's happening already. Now, you can try and find the traces of it. You can try and isolate it. But it's not like you're inventing it, you're imposing it. And so Derrida will say this happens all the time. If you go back to the text that we've been quoting from Derrida, look what it's called. Discourse of the Human Sciences. Okay? The human sciences. Gadamer himself, in this universality of the hermeneutical problem, he's dealing with the problem of the natural and social sciences, saying that they are imposing a method which has got all kinds of exclusionary presuppositions. We won't have this, we'll bracket out this, we'll put that in the margins, and this is what will construct knowledge out of it. And the hermeneutical task that Gadamer wants us to consider is how do we bring back in some of those excluded and marginalized notions and understandings, even into the scientific paradigm, which is itself always going to deconstruct. And arguably, you can say it's far easier to see a scientific text deconstruct itself than it is to sometimes see an artistic text, because some of the presuppositions are there in a much more blatant or explicit manner.
Okay, I just have two more from the board, and then we'll be done. This is about urban design. I think it's really interesting because it's asking us not to think about people or gestures or screens, but about buildings and communities. So in an urban design context, globalism can be said to result in a commodity-inspired culture. When looking at a city building as one's community, then a symbolic construct where image plus branding or signifier plus signified create a kind of cultural identity.
Yeah. So just as we were talking about the value-laden language and text, that there is no such thing as a valueless text, so too in the way that we construct our spaces, our world around us, architecturally or in terms of urban design, all of that is laden with value. Now, you might say, well, it's just a building, and we happen to put a park beside it. You know, there's purely pragmatic reasons for this. No. As a good researcher, what you'd want to do is say, well, no, the way that we have understood space in this context has already come with its own presuppositions, already caught up in a web of relations, and that we are constructing, or we are trying to construct, a certain vision of the way we think we situate ourselves in the world as citizens, as human beings. So the kinds of laws that we come up against in terms of building codes or in terms of urban planning, the restrictions that are in place, the way that we might, understand what an inner core is and an outer core, the way that we would see a suburb as more affluent, and then we have less investment in other areas of less affluent, and the way that all that develops, constantly valued with every move that we make. So the urban design major, or the urban design researcher, has got a lot of layers to be examining in the cultural semiotics that you confront the moment you step outside your front door. Well, even within the way your house is set up. The commodities, you talked about commodities there, the things that you buy and put in your house, are already determined. Your values already there. And then we're not just talking about trends and fashions. We're talking about values, ultimately. So, we have one more?
I do have one more, and it's a contrary question. So,
good. Yeah, we're going to finish with a contrary.
We're going to fix
it.
We'll finish with something contrary.
Well done.
The lecture began with the assertion that the implications of deconstruction are irrevocable. Like taking LSD, you're never the same afterward. One response to deconstruction, however, might be to say, okay, so language is foundationless. There's no absolute metaphysical ground to meaning. But once we accept that meaning is socially constructed, that we produce meaning through shared, if tenuous and constantly evolving social processes, why can't we stop worrying about metaphysical foundations?
Excellent, Claire. I don't find that contrary at all. I'm not contrary at all. I did mention a certain anxiety that arose from some of these theories, and I was simply trying to point out why the conventions of the day would bristle with certain theories. But we've come quite a ways. Well, deconstruction has by no means been off limits for its own critical examination. Derrida himself has taken a very long and varied path throughout his career, moving eventually into religious questions and law questions and questions of things like friendship and such. So nothing static here about the notion of deconstruction. Why should we worry? It's a good question. It's not a case of worrying. I'm not trying to set up new anxieties for anybody. On the contrary, I hope if you look at the direction of the slides, you see an emphasis on playing, in all the senses of playing. And playing isn't about finding the difficulties and the challenges and then worrying and finding yourself paralyzed. On the contrary, it is about opening up new spaces. And part of this is those new spaces might be, I don't agree. I think Derrida got it wrong here. I think Saussure got it wrong here. I think so-and-so got it wrong here. Many of these theories we've been talking about here have well been superseded. I'm not talking about the currency of the moment, but they are theories that are important in the sense that we just can't ignore them. We can't say, well, they didn't happen, we'll just leapfrog over them. If you do that, then you'll miss a very important cultural shift in attitudes and thinking that is perilous to your own understanding of your world. You've got to take this on board. What you do with it after that is completely up to you. And whether you would say, well, why worry about it? You know, we are living in a post-metaphysical age. Sure we are. What does that mean, though? What does that ultimately mean? Let's ask that question. What would it mean not to worry? And is not worrying ever a good position to be in? There, I'll throw that back at our questioner. Should we ever be in a position where we're not worrying? Is that a worrying position? Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for a wonderful talk and wonderful questions.
Indeed, thank you.
We'll be back next week in Glasgow to talk about performativity and gesture, I presume. Thank you all who were here with us today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.